She was arrested for being a black suspect. But one phone call changed everything in minutes. Michelle Johnson never imagined her Tuesday morning would end with her sitting in a cold interrogation room, handcuffed, with tears of indignation streaming down her face. The 28-year-old nurse had just finished another double shift at the hospital when her life turned upside down. It all started when she stopped at the supermarket to buy medicine for her diabetic mother. Michelle picked up the prescription, checked the medications and headed to the checkout. That's when the security guard approached her, claiming someone had reported her for stealing products. Even after showing the receipt and explaining she was a nurse, she was taken to a back room of the store. Detective Richard Thompson had been on the job for 15 years and thought he'd seen it all. When Michelle was brought into the station, he barely glanced at the document she tried to show him. The report had been made anonymously by phone, alleging that a black woman in hospital scrubs was stealing expensive medication. "Listen here, miss," the detective said, not looking up from his computer. "You work at the hospital. You have easy access to drugs. It's pretty suspicious for someone like you to be buying these expensive meds. Detective, please, look at my work ID. I've been a nurse for 8 years. These meds are for my mother, who's hospitalized at the same place I work. I can prove everything," Michelle said, trying to stay calm, though her voice trembled. The detective finally looked up, but his gaze was heavy with prejudice. All he saw was another young black woman trying to trick him with a well-crafted story. Over the past few months, several anonymous reports had come in about thefts at pharmacies and supermarkets, all involving black people. To him, it was obvious there was an organized ring. "Nice story," he muttered, "but anyone can get a prescription. Let's see what you have to say when faced with the evidence." Michelle felt her world collapsing. She thought of her mother, Mrs. Dorothy, who had been hospitalized for a week with diabetes complications. The 72-year-old had raised Michelle alone, working as a housekeeper to pay for her daughter's education. Now she relied on the special care only Michelle knew how to give. "My mother is waiting for these meds," Michelle said, fighting back desperation. "She doesn't understand why I didn't visit her yesterday. If you'll let me, I can call the hospital." "You're not calling anyone," the detective cut in. "First, we're clearing this up. You know stealing medication is a serious crime, right?" The interrogation room was small and stuffy. The grey walls seemed to close in around Michelle, who had never imagined she'd be in this situation. She worked 2 shifts a day to support her mother and pay for their small apartment. Every penny was accounted for, every expense planned in advance. The detective called in his assistant, Jennifer, a middle-aged woman who had witnessed plenty of injustices in that precinct. When she saw Michelle in handcuffs, something inside her tightened. The young woman didn't look like a criminal. Her eyes showed more fear and confusion than guilt. "Detective, her documents seem legitimate," Jennifer said, examining the work ID and prescription. "Documents can be faked, Jennifer. You should know that by now," Richard snapped. "These people are clever. They know how to game the system." Michelle heard the comment and felt a sharp pain in her chest. "These people." The words echoed in her mind, bringing back painful memories of other times she'd been judged by the color of her skin. In nursing school, some classmates doubted her abilities. At the hospital, some patients questioned whether she was really a licensed nurse. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, please take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. The hours passed slowly. Michelle had lost count of how many times she'd explained the same story. The detective seemed determined to prove her guilt, asking repetitive questions and trying to find contradictions in her account. She thought of her mother, who must have been wondering why her daughter hadn't shown up for dinner. Mrs. Dorothy Johnson was proud of her nurse daughter. She always told the other patients that Michelle had graduated with honors and worked at the best hospital in town. The elderly woman didn't know that, at that very moment, her daughter was being treated like a criminal. The phone in the room rang. The detective answered irritably, but his expression gradually changed during the conversation. On the other end of the line was the nursing supervisor at St. Mary's Hospital, Sister Margaret, a 68-year-old nun who had dedicated her life to caring for the sick. "Detective Thompson, this is Sister Margaret from St. Mary's Hospital. I'm calling because one of our best nurses didn't show up for her shift today. Michelle Johnson never misses work. We're worried." The detective looked at Michelle with some surprise. He hadn't expected anyone to call looking for her, but he still held on to his suspicions. "Do you know this Michelle well?" he asked, trying to keep his tone professional. "Yes, I do. She's one of the most dedicated nurses we've ever had. She's worked here for 8 years and never had a single complaint. She cares for her diabetic mother with such tenderness. In fact, she even asked for an advance on her salary this month to buy the more expensive medications prescribed by the endocrinologist." Jennifer, who was listening to the conversation, gave the detective a meaningful look. That information matched exactly what Michelle had told them, but Richard still wasn't convinced. "Sister, could you tell me if this nurse has access to the hospital's medications?" "She does, like all our nurses. But there's strict control. Every medication is logged, every dose accounted for. In 8 years, Michelle has never had a single issue with medications. In fact, she's one of the people responsible for organizing our inventory control." The revelation gave the detective pause. If Michelle had easy access to medications at the hospital, why would she risk stealing from a supermarket? It didn't make sense. But his pride kept him from admitting he might be making a mistake. Sister Margaret kept speaking, and her words struck like arrows at the detective's prejudice. "Detective, I don't know what happened, but I can assure you Michelle Johnson is a person of integrity. She could be making much more money at private clinics, but she chose to stay at the public hospital to care for those in need. She volunteers for 3 social programs in the city." Michelle heard Sister Margaret's words and felt tears welling up again. Someone was speaking the truth about her, someone who truly knew her. For the first time since she'd been arrested, she felt a glimmer of hope. The detective hung up with a troubled expression. Jennifer seized the moment to speak. "Detective, I think we should look deeper into this anonymous tip. Sister Margaret's information lines up with everything the girl has said." "Jennifer, you're too naive," Richard replied, but his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "Religious people always see the best in others." But something had shifted inside him. Sister Margaret's call had planted a seed of doubt, and that doubt grew with every passing minute. He looked at Michelle again, trying to see beyond his own prejudice. Michelle took advantage of the detective's hesitation to speak once more. "Please, detective, call Dr. Michael Anderson, my mother's endocrinologist. He can confirm that he prescribed these medications yesterday morning. The number is on the prescription." Richard took the prescription and for the first time examined it carefully. The handwriting was clearly medical, the stamp looked authentic, and all the information was correct. Reluctantly, he dialed the office number. Dr. Michael's secretary answered and confirmed that the prescription had been issued the day before for Mrs. Dorothy Johnson, the mother of Nurse Michelle. More than that, she mentioned that Michelle always accompanied her mother to appointments and that the doctor greatly admired her dedication as a daughter. Each call was a crack in the wall of prejudice the detective had built. But the main piece of the puzzle was still missing. Who had made the anonymous report and why? The answer came unexpectedly. The supermarket manager called the precinct, visibly nervous. He had discovered who made the report and had information that would change everything. "Detective, I need to speak with you urgently. We found out who reported the nurse. It was our cashier, Ashley. She confessed that she made up the story because she was angry. It's complicated to explain over the phone." The detective asked the manager to come to the precinct immediately. While they waited, Michelle remained seated in the cold interrogation room, unaware that her release was on its way. She closed her eyes and thought of her mother, wondering how she would explain this nightmare. When the manager arrived, he brought with him a young woman around 20 years old, clearly shaken and remorseful. Ashley had worked at the supermarket for 2 years and had never caused any trouble. But that day, something inside her snapped. "It was because of my boyfriend," Ashley confessed, tears in her eyes. "He cheated on me with a nurse. When I saw the woman in uniform buying expensive medicine, I wasn't thinking straight. I was so angry that I made up the story about the theft." The silence in the precinct was deafening. Detective Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He had arrested an innocent person based on the personal vendetta of a resentful employee. And worst of all, his own biases had blinded him to the truth right in front of him. Jennifer looked at the detective with an expression mixing disappointment and hope that he would learn something from this situation. The supermarket manager apologized repeatedly, promising strict action against the employee who had lied. Michelle listened to the confession in shock. All her anguish, all the humiliation, had been caused by the anger of a stranger. She thought of how many others might have gone through the same thing, victims of false reports fueled by prejudice or personal grudges. Detective Richard approached Michelle, removed her handcuffs, and for the first time, truly looked her in the eyes. What he saw there was the wounded dignity of a person who had been judged before even having a chance to defend herself. "Michelle, I apologize," he said with difficulty. "I made a serious mistake. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions." The words sounded sincere, but Michelle knew the trauma of those hours would stay with her for a long time. Still, she managed to respond with the grace her mother had taught her. "Thank you, Detective. I just want to go home and take care of my mother." But before she could leave, the phone rang again. This time it was Dr. Michael, the endocrinologist, calling the precinct personally. The news he brought would completely change everyone's perspective on Michelle Johnson. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us who are just starting out. Now continuing. "Detective, I heard Nurse Michelle is there." "I need her released immediately," said Dr. Michael, urgency in his voice. "Her mother is going through a severe diabetic crisis." Michelle is the only one who knows how to administer the special medication protocol we developed for Mrs. Dorothy. The revelation added even more weight to the injustice committed. While Michelle was being questioned, her elderly mother was suffering in the hospital, needing the specialized care only her daughter could provide. The officer immediately authorized Michelle's release, even offering a patrol car to take her to the hospital. She politely declined, preferring to call a taxi. Before leaving, Jennifer approached and whispered, "Sweetheart, I'm so sorry for what you went through. I hope your mother gets better." Michelle thanked her with a weak smile and left the station carrying not just her belongings, but also the mark of an injustice she would never forget. The taxi took her straight to St. Mary's Hospital, where she found Mrs. Dorothy conscious, but visibly weakened. "My dear, where were you?" the elderly woman asked, holding Michelle's hand. "I missed you." Michelle decided not to mention the arrest at that moment. Her mother was too fragile to bear the truth. Instead, she focused on administering the medication and monitoring vital signs, using all her professional expertise to stabilize the diabetic condition. Sister Margaret appeared in the room in the early hours, bringing Michelle a hot coffee. The nun had learned about the whole situation from Dr. Michael and was deeply outraged. "My child, what they did to you was unfair and cruel," Sister Margaret said, sitting beside Michelle. "But I want you to know that everyone who truly knows you understands your character." Michelle broke down in Sister Margaret's arms, finally letting all her anguish pour out in tears. It was the first time she had cried since being arrested. She had needed to stay strong for her mother. "Sister, will this happen again?" she asked between sobs. "Will people always distrust me because of my skin?" Sister Margaret's response was wise and comforting. "Sadly, we still live in a world full of prejudice. But you can't let that dim your light. You're an extraordinary nurse, a devoted daughter, a good person. That's what matters." In the following days, the story of Michelle's wrongful arrest spread through the hospital. Colleagues came to visit, expressing solidarity and outrage. The hospital director learned of the case and promised legal support if she decided to take action. But Michelle was more concerned with her mother's recovery than lawsuits. Mrs. Dorothy had been badly shaken and needed extra care. The dedicated nurse decided to take a few days off to be with her mother full-time. It was during these days at home that an unexpected visitor arrived. Officer Richard Thompson appeared at the door of their small apartment, bringing flowers and a formal apology. Michelle was surprised but received him with her usual grace. "Michelle, I came in person because I need you to know how deeply sorry I am," Richard said, visibly embarrassed. "I let my biases cloud my judgment, and that's unforgivable." Mrs. Dorothy, who was recovering on the couch, watched the conversation with curiosity. Michelle still hadn't told her about the arrest, making up an excuse about extra work at the hospital to explain her absence. "Officer, I appreciate your apology," Michelle replied, "but I want you to know this has deeply affected me. I've always strived to be an upstanding person, to study and work with dignity. Being treated like a criminal was one of the most humiliating experiences of my life." Michelle Johnson's words struck deep in the delegate's heart. He had daughters her age and couldn't imagine how he'd feel if one of them went through the same unfair situation. "I know my words can't undo what happened," Richard Thompson continued, "but I want you to know this has made me reflect on my professional conduct. I'm looking into courses on human rights and combating bias." The conversation lasted nearly an hour. The delegate spoke about his upbringing, how he'd absorbed prejudices without questioning them, and how Michelle's case had been a painful but necessary awakening. She listened quietly, realizing that in some way her awful experience might lead to something positive. When the delegate left, Mrs. Dorothy couldn't contain her curiosity. "Sweetheart, why was that man apologizing? What happened while I was at St. Mary's Hospital?" Michelle knew she couldn't hide the truth much longer. She sat beside her mother and carefully told the whole story. Mrs. Dorothy listened silently, her expression shifting from surprise to outrage, and finally to pride. "My daughter," the elderly woman said, holding Michelle's hands, "you faced this situation with the dignity I always tried to teach you. You didn't bow your head, you kept your composure, you stood by your truth. I'm proud of you." Her mother's words were like a balm to Michelle's wounded soul. She realized that despite all the injustice she'd endured, she'd emerged stronger and with a deeper understanding of society's complexities. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now, continuing. 2 weeks later, Michelle returned to work at the hospital. She was welcomed warmly by colleagues and patients who had already heard her story through the hospital grapevine. Her first patient of the day was a 75-year-old black woman admitted for heart problems. "Nurse," the patient said, taking her hand, "I heard your story. I want you to know you give me hope. My granddaughter is studying to be a nurse too, and sometimes she gets discouraged when people doubt her abilities. I'll tell her your story." Michelle felt a new kind of emotion. Her painful experience was inspiring others. She began thinking of ways to turn her trauma into strength to help those facing similar situations. At lunch, Sister Margaret called her aside for a private talk. The nun had an idea that could help many people. "Michelle, what if we organized talks about bias and civil rights here at the hospital? You could share your experience and guide people on how to respond to injustice." The idea excited Michelle. She realized she could use her voice to educate and raise awareness. She immediately accepted the proposal and began preparing for the talks. The first talk took place a month later in the hospital auditorium. Doctors, nurses, administrative staff, and even some able patients attended. Michelle shared her story in detail, explaining not just what had happened but how it made her feel and what she'd learned. "Bias isn't just a word," she said during the talk. "It's a destructive force that can ruin innocent lives, but it can also be fought with education, dialogue, and above all, the courage to question our own prejudices." In the audience, many were moved. Some black colleagues recognized similar situations they'd faced. Others, who had never experienced prejudice firsthand, began to better understand the reality of those who suffer discrimination. After the lecture, a young nursing student approached Michelle. It was Emily Wilson, 19 years old, in her second year of college, who constantly faced doubts about her abilities because of her skin color. "Nurse Michelle, your story gave me the strength to keep studying," said Emily, tears in her eyes. "Sometimes I think about giving up when I see how some professors treat me, but now I know I can overcome this." Michelle was deeply moved. That young student was going through the same struggles she had faced years before. She decided right then that she would become Emily's mentor, offering support and guidance throughout her academic journey. The news of Michelle's lectures spread beyond the hospital. Officer Richard Thompson heard about the event through a colleague who worked in the medical field. He was impressed by the young nurse's maturity and strength of character. He decided to reach out to her again, but this time with a different proposal. He wanted to invite her to give lectures at the police academy, helping train new officers with a more open and aware mindset. When he made the offer, Michelle was surprised. The idea of returning to a police station Even just to give lectures still unsettled her a little, but she realized it would be a unique opportunity to prevent others from suffering the same injustice. "Officer Richard," she replied after a moment of thought, "I accept your invitation, but on one condition. I want these lectures to be mandatory for all officers and detectives in the region, not just the rookies." The condition was bold, but the officer agreed immediately. He knew many of his veteran colleagues needed this reflection just as much as the newcomers. He began organizing the event, convincing his superiors of its importance. Michelle's first lecture at the police academy took place 3 months after her wrongful arrest. The auditorium was packed with officers of all ages and ranks. Some showed visible resistance, others genuine curiosity. Michelle began her speech simply and directly. "My name is Michelle Johnson. I've been a nurse for 8 years, and 3 months ago I was wrongfully arrested in this city. I'm here to tell my story, and I hope it helps you reflect on the importance of investigating before judging." The room fell completely silent. Michelle recounted every detail of her experience, from the encounter at the supermarket to the hours in the interrogation room. She spoke about the fear, the humiliation, the sense of injustice, but also about the importance of forgiveness and transformation. "I'm not here to attack anyone," she said during the lecture. "I'm here to show that we all have biases, but we can choose to question them and change. Officer Richard had the courage to admit his mistake and work to be better. That's the attitude I hope to see from all of you." During the break, several officers approached Michelle. Some apologized for similar situations they had witnessed or caused. Others thanked her for the life lessons she was sharing. A veteran sergeant with over 20 years on the force made a remark that stayed with Michelle. "Nurse, I have a daughter your age. After hearing your story, I'm going home tonight to talk to her about prejudice. I need to make sure she never goes through what you did." Those words showed Michelle that her pain was turning into real change. Every person who heard her story and reflected on their own actions was a small victory against prejudice. Michelle's lectures became well known throughout the city. Schools began inviting her to speak to students. Companies sought her guidance on diversity and inclusion, and social organizations requested her participation in events. She divided her time between her work at the hospital, caring for her mother, and awareness-raising activities. Mrs. Dorothy, proud of her daughter, always told her friends that Michelle had turned a bad experience into something good for society. 6 months after the wrongful arrest, Michelle received an invitation that would change her life again. The state university in the city wanted to offer her a scholarship for a master's degree in nursing, focusing on human rights and healthcare. The research project would examine the impact of bias on the quality of medical care. The offer was tempting, but Michelle hesitated. Pursuing a master's would mean less time at the hospital, less time caring for her mother, and less time for the talks she loved giving. It was a difficult decision that required careful thought. She had a long conversation with Mrs. Dorothy, who, despite her age, remained sharp-minded and always gave wise advice. "My dear," the elderly woman said, "you've already helped so many people with your talks. Imagine how much more you could do with a master's degree if you could officially research these problems and propose solutions." Once again, her mother's wisdom guided Michelle in the right direction. She accepted the scholarship, but negotiated to take the course in a way that allowed her to continue working part-time at the hospital and giving some lectures. Michelle's master's research became a landmark in the literature on bias in healthcare. She interviewed hundreds of patients, doctors, nurses, and other professionals, documenting cases of discrimination and identifying patterns that needed to be addressed. Her work caught the attention of researchers from other universities and international human rights organizations. Michelle began receiving invitations to participate in conferences and seminars in other states and even abroad. During her research, she crossed paths again with Ashley, the supermarket employee who had made the false accusation. The young woman had lost her job and was struggling with psychological issues due to the weight of guilt. When she learned Michelle was conducting research on bias, she asked to participate as an interviewee. The meeting was emotional for both. Ashley apologized once more, explaining she had sought therapy to deal with her feelings of anger and resentment. Michelle, with her characteristic generosity, not only forgave her but also offered to help her rebuild her life. "Ashley," Michelle said during the interview, "we all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them and striving to be better. Your participation in this research could help others avoid making the same mistake. Ashley's interview became one of the most impactful chapters of Michelle's master's thesis. It showed how bias can manifest indirectly through people who project their personal frustrations onto minority groups. On the day of her thesis defense, the auditorium was packed. Colleagues from the hospital, students, professors, and even Detective Richard Thompson, who had become a great admirer of Michelle's work, were in attendance. Her presentation was brilliant. Michelle presented her findings with clarity and passion, demonstrating how bias affects not only direct victims, but society as a whole. She proposed concrete changes to medical care protocols and the training of healthcare professionals. The examining committee was impressed by the quality of her work, and the approval was unanimous with honors. When Michelle received her master's diploma, Mrs. Dorothy sat in the front row, tears of pride streaming down her face, watching the daughter who had transformed pain into knowledge. After completing her master's degree, Michelle received an offer to teach at the university. She would be a professor of nursing ethics and human rights in healthcare. The opportunity was perfect for expanding her awareness-raising work in a more systematic way. She accepted the position, but kept her ties to the hospital, working as a nurse twice a week. She didn't want to lose direct contact with patients, knowing that this hands-on experience enriched her teaching and research. As a professor, Michelle became a role model among students. Her classes were always packed, not just with enrolled students, but also with those from other courses who wanted to hear her insights on bias and social justice. Emily Wilson, the young woman who had connected with Michelle after her first lecture, graduated from nursing school and was hired at the same hospital where Michelle worked. The two became close friends and professional partners. At Emily's graduation, she made sure to publicly thank Michelle. "If I'm standing here today as a nursing graduate, I owe so much to Professor Michelle Johnson. She showed me that we can confront prejudice with dignity and turn our struggles into strength to help others." Her speech moved everyone present. Michelle realized her story had created a positive cycle, inspiring a new generation of healthcare professionals who were more aware and prepared to fight discrimination. 2 years after becoming a professor, Michelle received a special invitation. The Pan American Health Organization wanted her to join an international project, combating bias in Latin America's healthcare systems. Accepting would mean frequent travel, working with governments across different countries, and contributing to large-scale public policies. It was a unique opportunity to expand her work to a continental level. But saying yes would mean leaving the hospital, reducing her university classes, and spending more time away from her mother, who was now 75 and needed more frequent care. It was another dilemma that required careful thought. She spoke with Mrs. Dorothy, who, as always, had the wisdom to guide her. "Sweetheart, you've already done so much for our city, for our state. Maybe it's time to do something for the world." "I'll be fine. I have Emily and other friends to keep me company when you're away." The decision weighed heavily on her heart, but Michelle knew it was the right choice. She accepted the international organization's invitation, but negotiated to keep some university classes and continue working at the hospital at least once a month. Her first international project was in Canada, where she developed protocols to identify and combat discrimination against Indigenous populations in healthcare. The work was challenging but deeply rewarding. During her stay in Toronto, Michelle met other researchers who had faced similar experiences of bias. Together, they formed a support and collaboration network that would extend across Latin America. Back in the United States, Michelle applied the lessons learned in Canada to new research projects. Her reputation as an expert in combating healthcare discrimination grew steadily, but she never forgot her humble roots or the experience that had changed her life. One Sunday afternoon, 5 years after her wrongful arrest, Michelle was at home sorting through old photos with her mother when Mrs. Dorothy shared a profound reflection. "Sweetheart, sometimes I think that terrible arrest was what led you to discover your true life's purpose. You were always a good nurse, but now you're so much more. You're an educator, a researcher, someone who changes the world one mind at a time." Her mother's words made Michelle reflect on her journey. Indeed, The traumatic experience had become the catalyst for a life dedicated to social justice. She had found her purpose through pain, transforming personal injustice into collective struggle. At that moment, the phone rang. It was Detective Richard Thompson, who kept in sporadic contact with Michelle, always updating her about the positive changes that had taken place at the police station. "Michelle, I'm calling with some news," said Richard, clearly excited. "We just received an anonymous complaint similar to the one that led to your arrest, but this time we followed all the protocols we developed after your training sessions. We investigated before acting, verified the information, and spoke with the accused person. We discovered it was another attempt at personal revenge disguised as a complaint." The news filled Michelle's heart with joy. Someone had been spared the humiliation she had endured because people had learned from her experience. It was concrete proof that her fight was making a real difference. "Detective Thompson," Michelle replied, "that's the best news I could receive. Every person who doesn't unjustly go through what I did is a victory for all of us." After hanging up, Michelle looked out the window of the small apartment where she still lived with her mother. She could have moved to a bigger, more luxurious place, but she chose to stay there, close to her roots, near the simple people who had shaped her. Her schedule was packed for the coming months. She had 3 international conferences confirmed, 2 ongoing research projects, classes to prepare, and a book to finish writing. But none of that mattered as much as knowing her story was saving others from injustice. The following week, Michelle would welcome another group of new nursing students. As always, she would begin the semester by sharing her story, showing that nursing is much more than administering medication and tending to wounds. It's also about defending human dignity and fighting for a fairer society. Emily Wilson, now an experienced nurse, had been invited to teach as a substitute professor. She followed in her mentor's footsteps, combining clinical practice with social activism. Together, they were shaping a new generation of professionals aware of their transformative role. Michelle Johnson's story had become legendary in the city. Students from various fields knew her journey. Healthcare professionals drew inspiration from her example, and even police officers cited her as a reference in their training. But for her, the greatest satisfaction remained caring for patients at the hospital, seeing the grateful smile of a healed child, the relief of a reassured family. These simple moments reminded her why she had chosen to become a nurse in the first place. Mrs. Dorothy, now 75, remained Michelle's primary advisor and source of wisdom. Despite her age, she stayed active and proud of the daughter who had turned pain into purpose. During their Sunday conversations, she always said that the wrongful arrest had paradoxically been a blessing in disguise. One Sunday, as they prepared lunch together, Mrs. Dorothy made an observation that deeply moved Michelle. "Darling, do you know what the most beautiful part of your story is? It's not the professional success, not the awards or recognition. It's that you managed to forgive without forgetting, to transform without growing bitter. That's what your grandmother called the wisdom of the heart." The words echoed in Michelle's mind all week. She realized she had truly found a difficult balance, keeping the memory of the injustice she suffered as motivation to fight, without letting resentment poison her heart. In her next lecture, she would include this reflection. She would talk about how it's possible to turn negative experiences into positive strength, how forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting or passively accepting injustice, but rather finding constructive ways to prevent others from suffering the same. Her international schedule was expanding. She had received invitations to work on projects in Colombia, Mexico, and even South Africa. Each new country represented an opportunity to learn about different forms of bias and different strategies to combat it. But before accepting new international commitments, Michelle wanted to complete a special project she was developing, creating a research center on bias and human rights in healthcare, affiliated with the university where she taught. The center would be a space dedicated to research, but would also offer free services for discrimination victims, training for healthcare professionals, and educational programs for the community. It would be a way to institutionalize and amplify the work she had been doing individually. To make the project viable, Michelle wrote dozens of proposals to funding agencies, international organizations, and private companies. She used her reputation and network to raise awareness among potential donors about the initiative's importance. The first major support came from an unexpected source, former officer Richard Thompson himself. He had retired from the police force and used his settlement to create a foundation dedicated to combating bias in law enforcement. His first action was to donate a significant amount to Michelle's research center. "Michelle," Richard said during the donation signing ceremony, "this is my way of trying to make amends for the harm I caused. I can't undo your wrongful arrest, but I can help prevent others from going through the same." The former officer's generosity deeply moved Michelle. It was further proof that people can change, that painful experiences can become opportunities for growth for everyone involved. With the initial support secured, other donors began showing interest in the project. Within 6 months, Michelle had raised enough funds to begin construction. It would be a modern, accessible building located in a central part of the city. During the groundbreaking ceremony, local officials, representatives from international organizations, academic colleagues, and most importantly, dozens of people impacted by Michelle's work over the years were present. Emily Wilson was chosen to be the center's first executive director, working directly with Michelle on project coordination. It was a symbolic choice. The student who had been inspired by Michelle was now becoming her partner in the fight against bias. The center's construction took 2 years. During that time, Michelle continued her normal activities, but with the anticipation of someone about to realize an important dream. Every construction phase was closely monitored, every detail planned to create a welcoming and functional environment. When the center finally opened, Michelle was 35 years old. Nearly a decade had passed since her wrongful arrest, and in that time, she had transformed from a dedicated nurse into an international reference for human rights in healthcare. The inauguration ceremony was emotional. Dozens of people shared stories of how Michelle's work had impacted their lives. Students spoke about transformative classes, healthcare professionals described changes in their practices, and bias victims expressed gratitude for the support they'd received. Michelle's speech was simple and touching. "This center isn't mine, it's ours. It belongs to all who believe we can build a fairer society where no one is judged by skin color, social background, or any other trait except their character. May this place be a beacon of hope for all fighting against discrimination." Mrs. Dorothy, now 77, sat in the front row, prouder than ever. At the end of the ceremony, she held her daughter's hands and said, "Michelle, your grandmother would be so proud. She always said God takes bad things from our lives to bring even better ones. Look what came from that terrible arrest." Her mother's words perfectly captured Michelle's journey. An injustice had become her life's mission. A humiliation had sparked social change. A personal experience with bias had led to collective improvements benefiting thousands. In its first months, the center handled hundreds of cases. Discrimination victims found legal and psychological support. Healthcare workers received human rights training, and researchers from various universities came to study the methods developed by Michelle's team. The center's success drew international attention. Delegations from other countries visited, eager to replicate the project. Michelle became an international consultant, helping establish similar centers across Latin America. Yet her professional achievements never lessened her dedication to family and roots. She still lived with her mother, still worked at the public hospital, still taught at the university. She had learned that professional growth didn't mean abandoning her core values. One December morning, a decade after her wrongful arrest, Michelle was at the hospital when a special patient arrived. Ashley, the former supermarket employee who had made the false accusation. Hospitalized with pregnancy complications, Ashley had specifically requested Michelle. Their reunion was emotional. Ashley had rebuilt her life, married, found a better job, and was now expecting her first child. She had sought therapy, confronted her biases, and grown into a wiser person. "Nurse Michelle," Ashley said, tears in her eyes, "I want my baby to be born by your hands. You taught me about forgiveness and change. I want you to be the first person my child sees in this world." Deeply moved, Michelle agreed to care for Ashley throughout the pregnancy and was present at the birth. When the healthy, crying baby arrived, She placed the child in Ashley's arms, feeling a sense of closure. "Ashley," Michelle said, watching mother and child, "everyone deserves a second chance. You made the most of yours and became a better person. Your son will grow up with a mother who learned the importance of respect and justice." The story of the birth spread quickly, embodying Michelle's life philosophy, turning negative experiences into opportunities for growth and reconciliation. It wasn't about revenge, it was healing. Not bitterness, but transformation. That same year, Michelle received the most significant invitation of her career. The World Health Organization wanted to name her Goodwill Ambassador for combating bias in healthcare systems. She would be the first American in this specific role. The appointment marked international recognition of her work and an immense responsibility. As ambassador, she would have a voice in global forums, influence health policies, and inspire millions of professionals worldwide. She accepted with humility and determination. In her first speech as ambassador during the World Health Assembly in Geneva, Michelle shared her personal story and connected it to the global situation. 10 years ago, I was wrongfully arrested simply for being a black woman under suspicion. That painful experience taught me that bias is a global epidemic, one that affects not just direct victims, but all of humanity. As healthcare professionals, we have a duty to heal not only bodies, but also mindsets. The speech was widely praised and shared across social media worldwide. Michelle became a global voice in the fight against discrimination, always maintaining her authentic and humble American spirit. Back in the United States, her schedule was busier than ever, but she never neglected her local commitments. Every Thursday, she still worked at the public hospital. Every Friday, she taught at the state university. And every Sunday, she had lunch with her mother and planned the week ahead. Mrs. Dorothy, now 79, watched her daughter's international career with admiration. Through online videos, she followed Michelle's speeches in different countries, always telling her friends about the girl she had raised with so much love, who now spoke to the entire world. One Sunday afternoon, as mother and daughter were organizing photo albums, Mrs. Dorothy shared a reflection that deeply moved Michelle. "Sweetheart, do you know the difference between someone who suffers injustice and becomes bitter and someone who suffers injustice and becomes wise? The first stays trapped in the past, the second builds the future. You chose to build the future." Those words became a mantra for Michelle. She repeated them whenever she faced challenges in her international work, whenever she encountered resistance to her ideas, whenever the weight of responsibility felt overwhelming. Her work as ambassador took her to countries with realities vastly different from the United States. In India, she addressed issues tied to the caste system. In South Africa, she worked with the legacy of apartheid. In the United States, she confronted racial bias in healthcare. Each experience broadened her understanding of discrimination's many faces. But it was during a visit to Sweden that Michelle had a profoundly moving experience. While giving a lecture on unconscious bias to healthcare professionals, an elderly nurse stood up and made an emotional confession. "Dr. Johnson, I've worked at this hospital for 40 years. I always considered myself free of prejudice. But your talk made me realize how often I've given less attention to immigrant patients, how often I've doubted the competence of black colleagues. Thank you for opening my eyes." The nurse's confession showed Michelle that bias truly is a universal problem, one that transcends borders and cultures, but it also proved that people can change when exposed to reflection and respectful dialogue. After another series of international trips, Michelle returned to the United States and decided to write a book about her experiences as an ambassador. It would weave her personal story with the cases she had encountered worldwide, offering a global perspective on bias in healthcare. The book took 2 years to complete. Michelle wanted each chapter to be meticulously researched and every story told with sensitivity and accuracy. She worked with translators, cultural consultants, and specialized editors to ensure the work was accessible and respectful. When Healing Bias, A Global Journey for Dignity in Healthcare was released, it became an instant international success. Translated into 15 languages, it was adopted as required reading in medical and nursing schools across multiple countries. The book launch ceremony in the United States took place in the auditorium of the university where Michelle Johnson taught. The event brought together officials, academic colleagues, students, and most importantly, people whose lives had been transformed by her work. Emily Wilson organized everything with care, ensuring every detail honored her mentor's journey. During the book presentation, Michelle made sure to dedicate the work to three special people. Her mother, who taught me that true nobility lies in character. Emily Wilson, who proved that a mentor learns as much as they teach. And all the victims of bias who had the courage to share their stories. The book's success opened new opportunities. Prestigious international universities began offering chairs to Michelle, publishers sought contracts for new books, and film producers expressed interest in adapting her story for the big screen. But Michelle was exhausted. 15 years of intense activism, constant travel, and growing responsibilities had taken their toll. She began to feel she needed a break, time to reflect on the next chapter of her life. The decision to take a sabbatical year was difficult. As a WHO ambassador, she had international commitments she couldn't simply cancel. As the coordinator of the research center, there were ongoing projects that relied on her leadership. As a professor, she had students who depended on her classes. But Mrs. Dorothy, now 81 and still sharp, gave Michelle the advice she needed to hear. "My dear, you've spent the last 15 years taking care of the whole world. It's time to take care of yourself a little. The world will keep turning. People will keep learning from what you've already taught. Rest, recharge, and come back even stronger." Her mother's advice was decisive. Michelle negotiated a one-year leave from all her official commitments, keeping only a few select lectures and her monthly work at St. Mary's Hospital. It would be a time to write, reflect, travel for pleasure instead of work, and most importantly, to be more present in her elderly mother's life. During the sabbatical, Michelle rediscovered simple pleasures she had forgotten. She returned to playing the piano, a hobby abandoned since college. She learned to cook special dishes for her mother. She read books completely unrelated to her professional field. She traveled across the United States, visiting places she had never seen before. It was during one of these trips to a small town in rural Pennsylvania that Michelle had an experience that would change the course of her life once again. She was visiting a rural hospital when she witnessed a situation that transported her back to the day of her wrongful arrest. A young black nurse was being falsely accused of medical negligence. The situation was clearly motivated by bias, but the young professional lacked the resources or knowledge to defend herself properly. Her colleagues, though aware of the injustice, remained silent out of fear of retaliation. Michelle couldn't stay passive. She intervened, offered legal support to the young nurse, and organized an impromptu lecture for the hospital staff. Within 2 weeks, the situation was resolved. The nurse was reinstated with formal apologies, and the entire hospital underwent human rights training. The experience showed Michelle that there was still much work to be done in the United States. Despite all her international success, there were still forgotten corners of the country where bias thrived unchallenged. She decided that when she returned from her sabbatical, she would focus more energy on national projects. The rest of her sabbatical year was spent planning this new phase. Michelle Johnson developed an ambitious project, creating a national network of centers to combat bias in healthcare, interconnected and coordinated from the center she had founded. It would be a way to nationalize the successful experiences she had lived through. When she officially returned to work, Michelle was renewed and full of energy. Her first action was to present the National Network Project to the Department of Health. The proposal was received with enthusiasm and approved in record time. Within 2 years, centers similar to hers would be operating in all state capitals across the United States. The implementation of the national network became the most complex and rewarding project of Michelle's career. She traveled across the country training teams, adapting methodologies to local realities, and establishing partnerships with universities and social organizations. It was hard work, but incredibly fulfilling. During one of these trips to inaugurate the center in Portland, Michelle received a special honor. A public school in the city had named a study room dedicated to human rights after her. It was the first time her name had been used to designate an educational space. The ceremony was simple, but deeply moving. Dozens of teenage students asked questions about her journey, showing genuine interest in following similar paths. A 16-year-old girl, the daughter of a school custodian, asked, "Professor Michel, how did you find the courage to turn something so bad into something so good?" The question touched Michel's heart. It was the same one she had asked herself many times over the years. Her answer was straightforward and honest. "My dear, courage didn't come all at once. It came little by little, with every person I was able to help, every injustice we managed to prevent. You aren't born brave. You become brave by doing what you believe is right, even when it's hard." The response became a motivational quote on the school's social media and later spread across the internet, shared by thousands. Michel realized her simple words had touched something universal in the human experience: the search for courage to do what is right. At 40, Michel had become a reference not only in her specific field, but in leadership and social transformation as a whole. She received invitations to speak at entrepreneurship events, women's leadership conferences, and personal growth seminars. But she always returned to her original focus: fighting bias in healthcare. It was this specificity that gave depth to her work and credibility to her contributions. She had learned that it's better to be an expert in one important cause than a generalist in many superficial ones. The National Network of Centers was performing beyond expectations. Data showed a significant reduction in discrimination complaints in public hospitals, increased patient satisfaction with care, and improved training for healthcare professionals. These were concrete results validating 15 years of hard work. During a national network meeting, Emily Wilson, now the Director General of all centers, presented a proposal that surprised Michel: creating an international exchange program for young healthcare professionals to study methods of combating bias in different countries. The idea was brilliant. Young Americans would go abroad to learn different approaches to the problem, while foreign students would come to the US to study the methods developed by Michel and her team. It would accelerate the spread of knowledge and create a new generation of global leaders in the field. The exchange program was approved by the WHO and funded by international organizations. Michel became the general coordinator, responsible for selecting participants, designing curricula, and evaluating results. It was work that perfectly combined her local experience with her global vision. The first exchange participants began traveling the following year. Seeing young American professionals presenting methodologies developed in their country to international audiences filled Michel with pride. The United States, which for so long had imported knowledge, was now exporting innovative solutions in the field of human rights. One of the exchange participants selected was the young nurse Michel had helped during her sabbatical year. The girl from rural Pennsylvania was now going to France to study public health policies at Sorbonne University. It was a full-circle moment that demonstrated the transformative power of education and proper support. Mrs. Dorothy, now 84 years old, watched all these achievements with growing admiration. Though her health was more fragile, her mind remained sharp, and she continued to be Michel's primary advisor. In their daily conversations, she always offered wise perspectives on her daughter's professional challenges. During one of these talks, Mrs. Dorothy made an observation that stayed with Michel. "My dear, do you know what makes me proudest about your story? It's not the success, not the awards. It's that you never forgot where you came from, never stopped being the humble girl I raised. The whole world may know you, but you're still my Michel, the one who cares for her old mother and works at the public hospital." Those words moved Michel deeply because they captured a constant struggle in her life, staying true to her roots while growing professionally. She had managed to find that balance, and her mother's recognition validated her choices. At the end of that year, Michel was invited to receive one of the highest honors in her field, the International Award for Human Rights in Healthcare, presented by the United Nations. She would be the first American woman to receive this distinction. The ceremony would take place in New York at the UN headquarters. Michel could bring 2 guests, and she had no doubts about her choices: Mrs. Dorothy and Emily Wilson. They were the 2 people who had been most important in her professional and personal journey. The trip to New York was special. Mrs. Dorothy had never left the United States, and seeing the city through her elderly mother's awe-struck eyes brought Michelle a new kind of joy. Emily arranged everything with care, ensuring the trip was comfortable and memorable for all three. The night before the ceremony, the three women dined at a restaurant overlooking Central Park. Mrs. Dorothy, elegant in her new dress, made a heartfelt toast. "I raise my glass to my daughter, who turned pain into healing, injustice into justice, and bias into love. And I toast to Emily, who is like a second daughter to me. You two are my greatest pride." The toast was met with emotional tears. Michelle looked at the two most important women in her life and felt immense gratitude. Her journey had been marked by challenges and triumphs, but she had never been alone. She had always had her mother's unconditional love and Emily's loyal partnership. The award ceremony was magnificent. The UN auditorium was packed with representatives from 193 countries. When they announced Michelle Johnson's name, the applause was long and moving. She walked onto the stage under the proud gazes of her mother and friend. In her acceptance speech, Michelle made sure to tell her story from the beginning. 20 years ago, a young American nurse was wrongfully arrested for being black and suspected. In that moment of humiliation, she never imagined her pain would become her life's purpose. Today, this nurse stands before you, not as a victim, but as proof that we can turn injustice into positive change. The speech was interrupted several times by applause. When Michelle finished, she received a standing ovation that lasted nearly 5 minutes. Backstage, Mrs. Dorothy wept with emotion, held in the arms of Emily Wilson, who also couldn't hold back her tears. End of story. Now tell us what you thought of Michelle Johnson's transformative journey. Do you believe it's possible to turn painful experiences into strength to help others? Share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more inspiring stories like this one. Your support is essential for us to keep sharing narratives that touch hearts and make a difference in people's lives.